This video will show you how to do an admission in Clinic Manager. Accessing the admission screen can be done via the following menu option: New Patient Admission, or a much quicker way is by clicking on this shortcut right over here. You will notice that a lot of my information is already filled in. Obviously, when it comes time for you to do your first admission, your information will be blank and you will type it all in. Any field that has an asterisk next to it is mandatory, and that information must be entered in order for the admission to proceed. The fields that do not have an asterisk next to it do not require information to be filled in, but obviously it is advisable for as much information to be entered when the patient is in front of you as possible. However, this information can be entered after the admission is finished. Clinic Manager now validates an ID number to make sure that it's a valid South African ID. If an ID number is perhaps fraudulent or incorrect, a message will appear informing you that this is not a valid South African ID number. Obviously, you are allowed to admit patients that are not South African and who may not have ID numbers. For example, if you have a patient that only has a passport, what you would do is you would enter the passport number in the ID field and tick the box that says this is not a South African ID. This will allow you, you see here, this is telling us that it doesn't recognize 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as a South African ID number. But if we tick this box, this will allow us to continue with the admission regardless of the fact that it's not a valid South African ID. You would need to do this for the patient and for the account holder if they are the same person, or if the account holder also only has a passport number. Something else that I should point out, we have a long list of possible titles. If there's a title that is not there that you need added, contact us and we will add it for you. Choosing a medical aid works like this. The magnifying glass will bring up a list of all possible medical aids. If there's a medical aid that is not in this list, again, contact us and we will add it for you. It is not advisable for you to add a medical aid yourself because you may not know what price sheet to use, especially if you are an NHN facility and certain price sheets are assigned to certain medical aids. We are in a better position to know which prices to use, and failing that, we'll get in touch with the NHN on your behalf to find out what pricings to use. So rather contact us for the additions of medical aids. But something else to note is that many times a medical aid may have a low-cost option. When this happens, there may be a low-cost price sheet associated with that low-cost medical aid. It is therefore necessary for us to split those medical aids into a normal and into a low-cost option. What this means, and I think we should use Discovery as an example, is that when you are admitting a Discovery patient who may be on a low-cost option, such as KeyCare, if you search for Discovery Health, and we select this, and we look through our options, we're not going to find the KeyCare options listed there. These are all the regular Discovery options. The KeyCare options are actually listed under a separate medical aid, listed as Discovery Health KeyCare options. This is just an example, but you may think to yourself that we don't have the medical aid that you need listed, when in fact it might actually be there. You just need to make sure that you've selected the right medical aid from the list in order to give you the options that you need. If you've done this and you still can't find the right medical aid, that's when you get in touch with us to add one for you. So if we go to KeyCare, here are all our KeyCare options that we can choose from. Everything else is quite self-explanatory on this first screen. If you have a medical aid number, the dependent number, and any authorization details supplied by the medical aid, you can enter it right now. But remember, this information can also be added later. For example, if the patient does not yet have an authorization number, that can be added later. When you click continue, what will happen is something called an eligibility check. What this is us sending all of the information that you have entered to MediCredit, where MediCredit will then verify that they have the same information on their side. When I click continue now, it will fail because this is not a real patient. When you do your eligibility, what you are hoping to see is a green tick to say that everything is fine. If you don't get a green tick, it doesn't mean that you can't carry on with the admission. What that means is that it's probably a good idea at this point to just check with MediCredit as to what information they have on their side for this patient and why doesn't it match what you have. Sometimes the eligibility check will actually tell you what the problem is. So for example, if you've entered your first name of the patient incorrectly, it might come up and say invalid first name, and you will immediately know that you need to go and change the spelling of that name. But other times it might not be so simple, and that's when you would then speak to MediCredit to find out what detail are they not happy with. So you can see here, I've got my error, but we're going to continue with this admission because we knew we were going to get that error. And now it asks us, do you want to continue? Sometimes at larger hospitals, if they do get eligibility failures, they still put the patient into a bed, and only then do they check with MediCredit as to why they're getting this eligibility failure. It's sometimes not great to leave patients standing while you check whether they are valid or not. Some hospitals like to first get the patient admitted and then check to make sure that everything is correct. But that's up to you. We're going to continue. All right, these are the next admission screens. And you can see at the top, we've got patient info, account holder info, then we've got other info, and the diagnosis. We'll cover these two tabs very quickly at the end, but these are the four very important tabs that we need to talk about. All right, it's very self-explanatory because it works exactly the same way as that first admission screen in terms of everything with an asterisk is mandatory and everything else can be entered later if you are in a hurry to admit this patient. But if your account holder and your patient are exactly the same person, you might not want to spend time putting all of the information in twice for the patient and then for the account holder. So what I want to show you a trick. If we then go, I'm just going to write, let me just put in test a few times, a work number. If we go to our account info tab, if we push the tab key multiple times, look what will happen. It's pulling the information from the previous screen into this screen, which will then save you from having to retype all of that information. You'll notice that a lot of the information from the first admission screen is already filled in, so you can leave that as is. One other thing to point out, our suburb field works like predictive text. So if you start typing in a suburb, you will see it will narrow it down until you find exactly the suburb that you're looking for. This particular set of books did not have the suburb that I entered, so I actually typed it in completely. But if we start typing in, for example, D, there's Durbanville in our list, and we can quickly select it. Suburbs are something that you can enter yourself. There will be a separate training video that will show you how to do that. Now we make our way to the other info tab. And this is quite important. The admission date and the admission time are automatically filled in by the system. Everything else you will need to select. So the referring doctor and the attending doctor. Doctors are added to our system much the same way that suburbs are added. And as I said a few minutes ago, there will be a separate training video that will also show you how to add doctors onto your system. So these are just selected from a list. And if we click on referring doctor on this button, it will bring up a list of our referring doctors that we can choose from. It's much the same with the attending doctors. You choose your doctor, and there they are. Some facilities have a second attending doctor and some have an anesthetist. If you do need that, it is available. And if you don't, you can just ignore it. You will choose the billing code that the patient needs to go on. The majority of the time, your accounts will most likely be a normal fee-for-service billing code, which will then show everything that you bill on the statement. The patient's stay, the medication, any tariffs and ward rates, all of that will display on the statement. However, there are other billing codes available, such as a per diem billing code or a fixed fee. These you will choose case-by-case basis, changes depending on the patient. Then you'll choose a bed to place the patient in. You choose an empty bed, and then it will allow you to choose what ward rate you would like to charge this patient. If we'd like to charge a normal general with overnight, you will see that for this particular medical aid that the patient is on, Clinic Manager tells you what the daily rate is. You will also notice that if you make a mistake, for example, we've now placed the patient into bed AA88. And if we select a ward rate that does not include an overnight rate, for example, general without overnight, you will see that Clinic Manager will automatically take away the bed, because you can't have a patient in a bed who's not staying there overnight. Similarly, if we now have no bed selected and we choose general with overnight, Clinic Manager will tell us you first need to select a bed. So the program is very careful to guide you through this process without making mistakes. So let's go back and give our patient a bed, and we'll say general with overnight. And here's the amount that we can tell our patient they'll be paying per night. And then we choose what unit the patient will be in, or which ward, and what type of patient they are. This will obviously be unique to your facility. So in my example, this is a psychiatric facility, and we will put the patient into the addiction unit, and we will say that the type is other, because we don't have an addiction type in our list, so we're going to say other. Majority of the time, you'll be admitting inpatients. Obviously, we do have the ability to select casualty or outpatients if you need the status to be either of those two. Over the years, we've added a lot of extra features for some of our clients that are very specific to their facilities, which is why a lot of these other features can be ignored. Over here, none of the third generation babies or sending SMSs to referring doctors. These are features that are nice to have, but nothing that you sort of need to do the admission. The one thing that is worth pointing out, though, is the original referrer. This is very good for stats purposes, as it allows management to see where most of the patients are coming from. So for example, if we choose original referrer, one of the options in this test data, I have actual names of doctors who could have referred patients. At your facility, you might want a referrer listed as something like Google, for example, or psychiatrist. And then you can put in the name of the doctor, or for example, if your original referrer is internet, the name could be Google. And what this does is it allows you to see where are most of your patients being referred from. So you might find it interesting to know that most of your patients found you on Google. You might find it interesting that a certain doctor is always recommending your facility. So this is not something that's mandatory through an admission, but it is something that is a nice to have, and I just wanted to point it out to you. Now we're going to move on to the diagnosis tab. This tab is very important as it will tell the medical aid why the patient is at your facility, for which treatment. If your facility uses CPT codes, you can insert those by clicking on the insert button. We provide a full list of CPT codes, but if there's a CPT code that is missing, you can add it yourself, and I will show you in a separate video how to do that, or you can ask us to do it for you. It's much the same with ICD codes. and diagnosis codes. This particular set of data does not have any diagnosis codes because this isn't required in order to send off a claim. ICD codes and CPT codes, that's a different story. But diagnosis codes are not mandatory. You might want a diagnosis code that says, for example, anxiety. You could add that, and we can say the diagnosis was anxiety disorder. But this is up to you. And again, in a separate video, I will show you how to add diagnosis codes. If we move across to the comments tab, there are a lot of comments that are added automatically once the admission is finished. For example, who did the admission? What medical aid the patient was admitted on? The date and the time. All of those things are automatically placed in the comments. So this field is more for anything extra that needs to be noted during the admission. So, for example, we have fields down here especially for certain things like dietary requirements, if a patient requires halal meals, or if there's a confidentiality clause. So, for example, if you have a VIP in your facility and no one must say anything about this person being in your facility, you can make a note of it during the admission. You can also type in free text in this comment field. For example, if somebody needs to check something as soon as the admission is finished, you can make a note and say, check with medical aid that patient is a valid member. This is just an example, but it's a comment that you can add to the account just so you know to check something. If your facility has a webcam and you want to take photos of your patients, we do have the option to do that if you have a webcam linked. But a lot of our facilities do not take photos of their patients, so this is up to you. And if it is something you'd like to use, get in touch with us and we will set it up. When you've satisfied that all of the information has been entered, you can click enter and it will take you to the final step of the admission process. This will give you the next reference number available, which you can change if need be, but we do not recommend that you do this because you obviously don't want a gap in your sequencing. So you don't want your reference numbers to go from 33 to 35 suddenly, because an auditor will wonder what happened to account number 34. This is for very specific cases and is not something that should be played with very often. Usually, Clinic Manager will give you the next number automatically and you just use that number. If you would like to print admission forms or labels, you can do so here and you can choose how many of each you would like. But if you don't want to print them, you can always print them later. We can say no and you can say okay. And once this is done, your patient will be admitted. And it will take us to the very first screen of the admission to ask us whether we want to do a new admission. And you can see here, all my information is already filled in again, but this is just if you have another patient waiting for you and you want to can quickly do another admission. This is not something that you have to do. You can just say cancel, and that's the end of the admission process. Thank you for watching this video.